Hello and welcome back to the course on Python programming. Today, now that we've loaded the dataset into Python, we're going to learn how to explore, how to perform that initial exploration of your dataset in Python. And the first thing I would like to do is to get rid of the top bits because we're going to need some space. This is going to be quite a heavy section in terms of how much we're going to be creating. So let's remove the header. Or before we remove the header, let's give this file a name. So we'll call it working. Let's just call it data frames. Data frames. And now we can remove the header. We can remove the toolbar and give ourselves some space. All right. So today we're talking about exploring your data. All right. Enter. Number one. What we already know is how to bring up the full data frame. Well, except for some parts that are going to be omitted, that are going to be in the middle usually. So there we go. So that's the full data frame. We can explore it like that. And we got some information at the bottom. All right, so that's a good start. Now, what are the other ways we can get some information very quickly about our data frame? Well, let's look at number two. Number two is number of rows. Let's have a look. Len stats. So stats is our data frame, and we're going to apply the len function to stats. So if we run that, we get 195 rows, which is correct. We do have 195 rows. Important thing about this function, even though it's a tiny little function, it's a tiny little call over here, so it doesn't look like anything significant, but in reality, it's a very important skill to know and a very important habit to have to check your length of your data set, so the size, the number of rows, and to also know when you need to check it, when you should think about it. Because from a data science perspective, it can be very, very telling, very important to do. And why is that? Well, back when I worked in consulting, we had to do it constantly, and we were importing data sets into SQL most of the time for analysis, but every time we would import data, we would always check the size or the number of rows, and in fact we would actually put in a comment in the code. We would say 195 rows imported. Why is that? Well, that is for traceability, so that later on you can always go back and check, was this number actually equivalent to the number that was supplied by the client, that was supplied in the file? Did anything happen during the import? Maybe something didn't get imported, maybe some rows were corrupt, maybe something was wrong. So for auditability and traceability purposes, we would always specify this value. And it's a good idea to check, especially if you have like large files that you're importing, and if you have information on how many rows there are supposed to be after the import, just quickly run this line and check how many rows were actually imported. And if it's all good, then you're safe in that sense. You know that you've done the check and you can proceed with your analysis. But if you find something is wrong, then there'll be a red flag and you'll be able to fix it up quickly rather than finding out about it at the end of your analysis. All right, so number three. How do we do something with the columns? So one thing we can do with the columns is we can see the columns, right? Let's go back up and let's run the line. Here we're going to say stats, very simple, dot columns. If we run that, you will see the actual columns that we have. We have country name, country code, birth rate, with a small, notice a lowercase, users, internet users, income group. So in this case, it's kind of obvious because we already have, when you look at the data frame, we already have the columns. We can see them here. But sometimes you get data frames or Excel files, CSV files. So I've worked with files definitely over 20 columns, sometimes over 50, and it depends on the structure of your data set. Sometimes they can be lots and lots of columns. So in order to bring them up in a very nice, neat fashion, you can just call stats.columns. And another way to quickly count your columns, just use the len function. So let's quickly say for number of columns and say stats.columns. So basically you're passing this value into, or this object into here. So let's run this. You'll see that we have 5 columns. Again, here it was very easy to tell. Sometimes there can be lots of columns, so you will need to check like that. Well, if you do need to check. All right, now we're going to move on to the fun stuff. Top rows. How do we see the top rows of our data set? Because we already noticed that it's quite cumbersome when we print out the whole data set. Sometimes, most of the time, you don't need to see the whole data set. You just need to get a feel for it. So in that case, you just do stats, head, and here, remember the brackets. So in case of columns, you do need the brackets, right? For heads, you need the brackets, because if you run without the brackets, you'll get a gibberish result. So there's our stats head. What it does is it prints out the top 5 rows. Remember, numeration starts from 0, so it goes 0 to 4. top 5 rows. And the other thing you can do is you can actually say stats head, and you can specify n equals 6, right? So n is the parameter, and if I specify here 6 or any other number, it'll give you that many rows. And by the way, this functionality is the same as the head function in R. It actually returns you 6 every time. It just looks different. So in that case, head is a function. Here it's a method inside the stats object. So this function, our method, is carried around with this object, so you can always call it from inside the object. That's the difference between object-oriented programming and vectorized programming, which is R, and other types of programming as well. All right, so that's the top rows. A very useful function, and you'll see us using it all the time. We'll be using it pretty much every single tutorial. Most of the tutorials in this section, we're going to be using this function, so we can see what's going on with our data set. All right, number 6, or you guessed it, bottom rows. Stats tail, run that. There you go, that's the bottom 5, because you can see 190 to 194, or you can do bottom 6 or however many you like. So that's stats tail. A story I always tell in this case. Luckily, head and tail are the same, as have the same names as in R. So if you've done R, it's going to be easy to remember. If you haven't, and this is something I struggled with originally when I came from SQL to R, that in SQL they're called top and bottom instead of head and tail. So how do you remember them? Well, just think of a fox. A fox has a head and a tail. I know fox is a random animal to think of, but whenever you're going to be wondering, you're going to remember Kirill said fox, which is orange, which is like a random animal to say, and you're going to remember that a fox has a head and a tail, and that way you'll remember which functions you need to call. But with time, especially if you finish this section of the course, you're going to be so used to typing the names of these functions that you won't even need to remember that little story. So we've done that. Let's have a look at a couple more. So we've got a few more left. Number 7, we've got get some information on the columns. So how do we do this? Well, very easy, stats.info. So if you run this, you will see some information. So it's got data columns, total 5 columns, actually 195 entries. So it tells you a lot of useful information. And here it tells you, okay, object, float 64, object. And basically, float 64 means a number with a decimal point. Object is, in this case, because they're strings, it's identifying them as just objects. What we need to know is that this is, I'm just going to put a comment here, this is like the str function in R. So not exactly the same, right? The str function gives you a bit more information and it can tell you about categorical variables, which in R are called factors. So in R, I would say that this function is a bit more powerful, but nevertheless, this one still gives you quite a bit of information. The other function that we want to know is get stats on the columns. So that was information. This is going to be stats, and we're going to say stats describe. The function we need is describe. You run that, and what you'll get is count, mean, standard deviation, minimum, first quartile, second quartile, third quartile, and maximum for all of the columns which have numeric data in them. And we only have 2 of those. So therefore, we have 2 results here. And this is quite a powerful thing. It is similar to, can you guess it? It is like summary, the summary function in R. Let's go back up. Like this was str function. So the summary function in R. And also, if you want to maybe change it around a bit, so this is like the names of the columns are on the top, then it goes downwards. If you want to transpose it, very easy done. So stats describe, and then just press dot. This is the object that we got, right? This is the new the result, and here we're going to say transpose also in with brackets, and that way you've transposed the matrix. It might be easier to read this way sometimes. In this case, I think it's easier like this because we only have 2 of these columns, and now they're rows, and now you can just read it very simply like that instead of reading from top to bottom. All right, so that is how we get information on our dataset, some basic information. Let's quickly recap what we learned. We learned quite a few functions today. So first way you can get information is, of course, print out the full data frame by calling its name. Then you can get the length of data frame by using the len function. So that's the number of rows. Also very important if you want to maintain auditability and traceability. Number 3, get visibility of the columns, stats.columns. Then len of stats.columns gives you a number of columns. Stats.head gives you the top X rows, however many you specify, 5 by default. Stats.tail, same thing, but for bottom rows. Stats.info gives you information on the columns, what they are, what types, and how many, etc. And stats.describe gives you a summary or some statistics on your numeric columns, and also you can transpose it. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Have a play around with that, just practice those functions a little bit, and then I will see you in the next tutorial. Can't wait to get started on that one. Until next time, happy coding.